So how has language been studied within the discipline of linguistics? Language is relevant to very, very, very many disciplines, and they all have their own sort of take on it. But there is the discipline of linguistics, which has developed over the 20th century, largely, and it has a certain way of approaching language, which has been extremely influential and which we need to look at in a little bit of detail. We need to understand what the subfields are, what kind of knowledge they generate, what kind of claims they make, what they're concerned with, and also, of course, what they leave behind. So speech and language, and we need to be careful about the distinction between the two, they encompass a huge array of phenomena that collectively give rise to the human world. Without language, there's no humans. Without language, there's no human world. So there's never going to be a single science of language, and linguistics, academic linguistics, tackles some aspects of what we generically understand by language, and the boundaries of language itself are always under revision. So, for example, the role of the hands in language, the role of the eyes in language are underexplored topics. And the scientific study of language is not terribly old, but scholars have been interested in language for 2,000 years longer. We can pretty much divide things up into three large eras. Before 1900, roughly, we have a scholarly field known as philology, which is concerned with texts. Then we have the birth of the scientific study of language in a field known as structural linguistics, which we'll only look at briefly. And then with that cognitive turn that happened after the Second World War, we get the birth in the 1950s of generative linguistics. Generative linguistics plays a very special role here. It's an academic field which has adopted one particular way to view the rich topic of language. Its concerns are highly abstract, and the view that it adopts with respect to language ignores lots of things that we know to be important about language. For example, the study of language within generative linguistics does not distinguish between the spoken word and the written word. We'll come back to that distinction later. Its importance within this module lies partly in the fact that the huge intellectual transition after the Second World War, the so-called cognitive turn, brought about an intellectual climate with a great focus on abstract formal structures, in which structures are built from symbols and they are arranged in sequence and manipulated by rule. These are all concepts that are coming from computational thinking. And generative linguistics these days has a bunch of specialized subfields, and we'll walk through 6 of them in sequence starting in the next video. As we do so, we'll be encountering fields which have one foot in and one foot outside the camp of generative linguistics. So pragmatics and phonetics will appear as not entirely within generative linguistics, but semantics, syntax, morphology, phonology. These are the core disciplines of generative linguistics. But before we get to that, before 1900 or here I've said 1850, these dates are all approximate, there was intense scholarly activity around texts. Texts occupy very valuable roles within society. Scripture plays a huge role. The rediscovery of the classical works of Greek and Latin authors in the Renaissance attracted a great deal of scholarly activity. For centuries, specific languages, since the Renaissance, I suppose, Greek and Latin were given very privileged positions, and they were taught to school boys more than school girls. And this brought about the field of teaching grammar as a way to teach these scholarly languages of Greek and Latin. People didn't used to travel as much as they did pre-pandemic. In the 20th century, mass travel took over. So when you go back 100 to 200 years, you won't find very many people going abroad for vacation. So there's a much smaller role played here in the teaching of foreign languages. These days, of course, the teaching of foreign languages is a huge field. And the teaching of Greek and Latin has almost disappeared. Certain authors were given revered positions here. So as well as things like scripture and the work of classical Greek and Latin authors, you've got specific people like Shakespeare or Milton who are granted a huge status within a given society. And so there's a lot of scholarly activity around all these, and they're very important activities, but none of them are particularly scientific, except in a very loose sense. Philology is concerned with language as it appears in text, as it's passed down, as it influences culture. It's concerned with matters of translation, of decoding old texts, interpreting texts, and construction of history through the study of texts. That's about all we'll have to say about philology, but if you're looking for a niche hobby, it's still a live and active field. Then, around the beginning of the 20th century, we see the birth of structural linguistics. This was very much in keeping with scientific activity of the time. So we've noted before that at the end of the 19th century, there was a huge increase in the amount of scientific work undertaken, in the proliferation of scientific fields, in genuinely exciting scientific results, which resulted in major social changes and developments of technologies. It's in this context, we've noted before, that the science of psychology arose, and language was another field which suddenly became the topic of a form of scientific inquiry which it had not been before. And in the spirit of late 19th, early 20th century science, there were an awful lot of facts, and a lot of the science consisted in assembling, marshalling, disciplining those facts, organizing them, and trying to make out what we now call a system. That is, to understand language in a sense as if it were disconnected from everything else in the world, as a domain in its own right with certain inevitable characteristics. Structural linguistics was overtaken in around the middle of the 20th century by generative linguistics. And yet the basic terms that arose in structural linguistics transferred to the new enterprise of generative linguistics. To get a feel for what structural linguistics is like, we're not going to do a lot here. Compare these two charts. The one on the bottom right is the periodic table of the elements from the domain of chemistry. It was a magnificent production that summarized, organized, and systematized centuries of observations by chemists and even alchemists. By placing the elements into this structure of the periodic table, the domain of chemistry profited hugely. The arrangements and interactions of the elements were recognized to be systematic, and what had previously been a whole host of more or less disconnected observations became connected together in a body of knowledge which is very secure to this day. So this was an example of the kind of work done in the late 19th century as the scientific climate changed. Now, on the top left, you can see another product from around this time. This is its most recent version from 2005, but the first version was also about 1890. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet. This is an attempt, a theoretically motivated attempt, to capture all the sound distinctions that occur in the world's languages. What's shown here is a chart that refers only to consonants. Vowels are handled differently. And you can see the same sort of systematization here for sounds as you see in the periodic table for elements. There's an arrangement here not by atomic mass or by electrons, but for consonants, the appropriate systematic arrangement is from left to right by where the consonantal sound is made in the mouth, from the lips all the way back to the throat. And on the y-axis, as it were, the manner in which that sound is made. plosives at the top are what we call stop consonants, like p, b. Then we have nasals, where the air flows through the nasal passages, like ma, n. Then there are other sounds, perhaps most familiar ones are the fricatives, where we get turbulent sound like s, th. So you can see this is an attempt to organize the sounds of the world's languages almost as if they were elements within a periodic table. That turns out to be slightly problematic, but we're not going to dwell on that. I want you to get from this the spirit of the organizing mentality that scientists brought to bear around the start of the 20th century. And this suggestion that language could constitute a systematic domain that could be studied in its own right, as if it were divorced from everything else, was the first introduction of what has come to be known as structuralism. So with structuralism, we get various domains of human activity, which are notoriously messy and culture-bound. We try to identify elements which belong together, which relate to one another, and which can be studied ignoring the background against which we identify them. So we suggest there might be a separate domain of structures which are rule-governed, lawful. And this started with the organization of languages, but the idea spread to many other human and social sciences. It became a way to try to understand the apparently wild variation in human culture and to identify within it certain subsystems that could be treated as if they were systematic. This had knock-on effects in anthropology, where instead of studying sound systems, you might be studying, for example, kinship systems. Kinship systems are found in every culture, and they vary from culture to culture. Your kinship system involves your understanding of a family as being a father and a mother and the kids. Maybe you have an extended family, and then you have aunts and uncles and perhaps in-laws. And if you go to a different culture, you may find the world of family relationships is very, very different, such that, for example, aunts are treated differently from uncles, or relatives on the mother's side are treated differently from relatives on the father's side, or the family has different borders. So anthropology looked at this variation and tried to understand it systematically. We see themes from structuralism arising in the social sciences, generally in psychoanalysis even, but its origins lie in linguistics. So that's enough of the background, and we'll move on in the next video now to more modern linguistics from the second half of the 20th century on.